This is the first year in a long time that Hannukah and Christmas fell on the same day. And when John said the festival of the dedication, that's Hannukah. So we thought it would be a good time for us to do some history work. So Gideon has put this together, a lesson for us. So I'm eager to learn. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay. Over the next couple of hours. Well, no, I'm not going to keep you from that amazing spread over there. Try the latkes. I made them. No, I'm going to take you on a journey that lasts 167 years to be precise. And it's one of the periods that doesn't get a lot of attention. It's between the Maccabean revolt, which we'll speak about, which is the basis of the festival of Hannukah, and the birth of Jesus. And those 167 years are very defining in the experience that Jesus will have after he's born and doing his ministry. And so we're going to, over the next 20 minutes or so, provide that context so we understand what was going on when Jesus was born. Okay, next slide, please. So most people, who have a slight knowledge of maybe Judaism and certainly Christianity, when you ask them, what's the connection between Christmas and Hanukkah, they will reply, there is absolutely no connection between the two festivals other than they fall around the same time of the year. And that is true. There is no connection. Christmas obviously is a very major holiday for festival for Christians. It's the birth of the Messiah, whereas Hanukkah is a very, very minor festival in Judaism. It didn't even make it into the Old Testament. The book of the Maccabees tell the story of the Maccabean revolt and the miracle of the oil, and it could be found in the Apocrypha, which was a book of writings that didn't quite make it into the Old Testament, but it does appear, those 4 books of the Maccabees do appear in the New Testament, and this is how we know about the Maccabees and their festival. Okay, so on the right side you see a candelabrum. So when Roger was reading the scripture readings this morning, I suddenly realized that these are 2 very disparate readings, one from Leviticus and the other from John. And I will get to the one from John, but first I want to speak about the one from Leviticus, which describes the building of this candelabrum that has to be set in the tabernacle or in the temple. And if you ever visit Jerusalem, there is an organization in Jerusalem that is recreating all of the utensils, all of the different things that were used in the temple. And this is a picture of that candelabrum. You'll notice that it has 3 branches on each side and 1 in the middle. This here is a Hannukah. This is what we light during Hanukkah, and I'll explain why we light it in a minute. And you'll notice it has 4 branches on each side and 1 in the middle. This is a very traditional one that's been in my family for generations. You'll see some more modern ones if you go to Target or Home Goods around this time of year. But this is a traditional one. So there is a difference between this Hannukah and the menorah that we see on the screen. So the menorah we see on the screen was in the temple, and it has 6 branches and 1 in the middle. This has 8. Okay, next slide, please. So, as I said, most people think that Hanukkah is about the miracle of the oil. So when the Maccabees, we'll get to exactly who the Maccabees are in a minute, but when they defeated the Greeks, or more accurately the Seleucid Empire, and they went into the temple, they found a statue of Zeus in the temple, they found that it had been desecrated, pigs had been sacrificed on the altar, and they needed to cleanse it. it. So the first thing they did, they wanted to light the candelabrum, the menorah, but they only found one little pot of oil. And now this has to be very special oil. It's holy oil that they used for lighting the candelabrum. And there was only enough oil to last one day. But the miracle of Hannukah is it lasted 8 days. And that's why we light 8 candles. And tonight is the 5th candle. So we're on the 4th day. First day started on the 25th of December. And we light it until we reach the 8th. So that's the story that everybody knows about Hannukah. But there is much more to it. Next slide, please. So a little bit of history, a little bit of background, okay? So have we all heard of Alexander the Great from Greece, who conquered an empire? So Alexander the Great dies in 323 BCE. I say BCE, that's before Common Era. Okay? He was 32 years old at the time, and he didn't have an heir. Eventually, his massive kingdom was divided between his generals. So there was 3 parts to the empire. There was the Ptolemaic Empire, which was North Africa, Egypt, and as we can see in this map, part of modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. And then the Seleucid Empire, which really interests us, which is the northern part, Turkey, Middle East, Iraq, modern-day Iraq, Persia, and so on. And then there was another very small part in Macedonia, which we don't need to talk about. Okay. So the interesting thing here is that the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire went to war many, many times. Why they went to war, I don't know. They weren't satisfied with the land they had. But if you notice that green part there that is modern-day Israel, it's a land bridge. And they both wanted to control that land bridge. So there was a lot of back and forth between these 2 empires, and they eventually the Seleucid Empire conquered that land, which included the land of Judea, and we find ourselves now under the Judeans under the rule of the Seleucid Empire. Next slide, please. So the Seleucid Empire, as was the tradition back then, believed in Hellenism. Now, Hellenism is not just a religion. Yes, Hellenism, they do worship Zeus. This is Zeus. And they established temples and statues of Zeus in every place. And that's why they actually put a statue of Zeus in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and they made people worship Zeus. But there was a lot more to Hellenism than just Zeus. Our system of democracy originated from the Greeks, from Hellenism. They established polis, metropolis, which is cities on a grid. What are cities? Usually on a grid. Cultures, theatre, gymnasiums. Now they did worship the human form in very overt ways, especially during sporting events. And this might be one of the things that put the Judeans off this whole idea of this culture. But I think personally, if I was living back in those days, I would look at Hellenism and I'd say, whoa, this is the future. This is really enlightened. This is democracy. This is everybody has a voice. This is so different. This is the future. You know? But they did oppress the Judeans, and I say Judeans. Judeans are people who live in the land of Judea. Eventually, we derive from that the word Jew. But at this time, they're called Judeans because they live in that land called Judea. They were oppressing the Judeans at this time. They were forcing them into Hellenism, and around that time there started to be talk about resistance. So we're talking about now 168 BCE. Next slide, please. So This is an interesting map, actually, because it shows on the left we have what is Judea. It really is a very, very teeny piece of land. I can tell you, I've lived there. I know how small this is. It's teeny. Literally, you could walk from one side to the other in a single day. And eventually, in less than 100 years, we're getting to a situation where the Maccabees have conquered the Seleucid Empire, and they've recreated, more or less, the land that was biblically given to the Israelites, to the 12 tribes, which we read about in Deuteronomy. So I'd say they've not, maybe 10 times bigger than it was, maybe more. So, we can see here modern-day Israel, parts of Lebanon, parts of Syria, parts of Jordan, all became one part of this empire that the Maccabees were creating. Next slide, please. So this is going to be a little difficult for you to read from there. So I'm going to highlight this is the dynasty of the Maccabees, which is also called the Hasmonean dynasty. Okay, so it started in 167 BCE with Matthias, who was the patriarch of the family. Now the Maccabee family were from the priestly family, the descendants of Moses' brother Aaron, so they were able to serve in the temple. They were the kind of keepers of the faith, and they revolted against the Seleucid rule. Now, he had 5 sons. Eventually 4 of them were killed in battle, and there was only 1 left. The one that's spoken most about in the book of Maccabees is Judah Maccabee, also known as Judah the Hammer, and he was the one who really defeated the Seleucid Empire. He did most of the groundwork of setting up this victory over this massive empire. Imagine, a teeny little country today going up against the United States. It just can't happen. It makes no sense. But this little band of freedom fighters went up against the Seleucid Empire, and they prevailed. It took them about 20 years, but they got there eventually. Really, when we look about what they did, mostly they were killing their fellow Judeans who had converted to or adopted Hellenism. So most of what they were doing was localized skirmishes and attacks against their fellow brothers. But there were obviously wars against the Seleucid Empire. But the Seleucid Empire, it's important to note, was already in decline at this stage in 168 BC. So for them to not have to deal with this bunch of annoying freedom fighters was probably a good thing, and they moved out eventually. So the only one remaining out of the Hasmonean dynasty at this point was a guy named Simeon, and he had a son called John Hyrcanus. And he was the one who began to expand their land. And he conquered, in Greek it's called the Idumeans. We call them Edom. Now, who is Edom? And this will be very important later on. Who is Edom? Edom is the people who originated from
Esau's son.
Esau. Okay, Esau. So Esau had red hair. In Genesis we read about that. He had red hair. The word Edom in Hebrew means red. And his descendants were the Edomites.
Yeah, lots of hair on his body. Remember, he was a hunter?
Yeah. So he conquered them and forcefully converted them to Judaism. We'll come back to that in a minute because it's going to be really important. His son became emperor, became king, Alexander Janus. Up to that point, they didn't have kings. They didn't call themselves kings. They called themselves protector of the Commonwealth. So they had the Jewish Commonwealth. But Alexander Janus decided to take on the role of king, and he also was the high priest. Up to that point, there'd been a total separation of state and religion. And this is a great example of why you should keep separation of state and religion, because it's disastrous what happens after this. So now you've got the high priest who is controlling the religion, and he's also the king. Okay? There's going to be a lot of problems with that. Alexander Janus is actually the one who expanded the empire. He eventually died, and he named his wife Salome Alexandra to be the queen. Okay. And for a period about 9 years, I would say this was the most stable period in the Hasmonean dynasty. She's well known in Jewish liturgy. A lot of, in Hebrew, she's called Shlom Tzion, and there's a lot of kids these days who, especially in Orthodox Jewish families, who are called Shlom Tzion after her. She had two sons, Aristobulus, who became king and high priest, and another nasty little character called Hyrcanus II. Notice how all these names are Greek. Isn't that funny that the Maccabees fought to eradicate Hellenism from their midst, and yet they've become totally Hellenized? And in fact, at this time, Hellenism isn't just, something that is on the side. No, it's fully accepted. They have brought 100% by this time into Hellenism. They've mixed it with Judaism because they're the high priest. Of course they have to. But now, the problem with Hyrcanus II is that he wanted to be king and high priest, and his brother wouldn't let him. So what did he do? There was this new empire that was looming on the horizon called Rome. And he went to them and he said, come on in. I'll give you this land. Just make me king. And they did. And the Romans came. Yes, it wasn't so simple. They walked in. Yeah, there was some skirmishes, but the Romans took over the land of Judea, the land of Israel at that time. An interesting point that I want to make here is that so this short period where the Maccabees, the Hasmonean dynasty, reigned over the land of Israel, it was the only time since the destruction of the first temple in 587 BCE, that the Jews had their own land. They were in control of their land. Remember that the first temple of Solomon, was destroyed by the Babylonians. The Babylonians occupied this area. And then the Persians conquered the Babylonians. So it was ruled by the Persians, and then later the Greeks. And so this is a short period of time that the Jews actually are in control of their land. It took 2,000 years minus 11 years, which I find amazing, for the Jews to be in control of that land again. 1948, the Jews were able to settle the land of what is now Israel. 2,000 years. So in the whole history, since the time of Solomon, his sons divided the empire, and since then, except for this short 80-year span, the Jews were not in control of their own land. Okay. Now, the thing about Hyrcanus II is that he made friends with a guy who was an Edomite, who had converted to Judaism, and his name was Antipater. and he made him like he made him some sort of ruler, but the trouble was he had a son who was very ambitious, and that son's name was Herod. We know Herod from the New Testament, don't we? Mm-hmm. And you'll see at the bottom in red, there's Herod down there. Herod claimed the throne, and he did so by marrying, first of all, he killed off everybody who could possibly be king. And then he married this woman from the Hasmonean dynasty called Miriam, and promptly killed her. So we're down at this time, 29 BCE, 29 years before the birth of Christ. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I want to talk about religion. I recently read a very interesting study that it asked the question, what was the religion of the Israelites pre-Hasmonean dynasty, before the Maccabean revolt? And the truth was, that came out in this, and it was based upon archaeological evidence, that they didn't have much of a religion at all. If you think about it, the whole practice of religion, of the Jewish religion, was centralized around the temple. Outside of the temple, you did not have that practice. Everything happened around the temple in Jerusalem. So how do people observe their religion? How do they know which laws to follow? How do they know how to follow those laws, even if they knew about them? And so in order to differentiate themselves from the Hellenists, the Maccabees had to come up with a new look at the Jewish religion. And they said, well, we've got this Bible here, we've got the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Let's use this as our religion. Well, you look in the Bible, and God says, keep the Sabbath day, make it holy, don't do any work. Well, what does that mean? What does it mean not to do work? So around this time, we've got people coming up and discussing, what does it mean to follow this religion? And they start, and this is the Pharisees who are doing this. We've heard about Pharisees and Sadducees. So the Pharisees start discussing amongst themselves things like the Sabbath. What does it mean to not work on the Sabbath? And they came up with all sorts of strange ideas, like working is doing your profession. It means if you're a doctor, you can't heal on the Sabbath. Makes sense? You can't walk more than 1/6 of a mile. You can't carry. Work is lighting a flame, because, you had to rub 2 flints together, or however they did it back then. That's work. Okay, you can't light a flame, so you can't cook on the Sabbath either. Okay? So suddenly you've taken this very small portion of this commandment to keep the Sabbath holy and not do any work, and suddenly it's this massive thing. The same with the dietary laws. So I think it's in Leviticus, it says, don't cook a young goat in its mother's milk. Now that actually comes about in a whole set of moral laws. So you'll think, yeah, this is a moral law, but no, they took it as a dietary law and saying you can't eat milk and meat together. So they said, well, what's meat? Meat comes from an animal. How do you define an animal? What's an animal? An animal is a mammal. It has milk. But a chicken isn't a mammal, is it? It's a bird. But we can't eat chicken and milk together. Why? Because the rabbis back then, the Pharisees, said, well, let's say you see your friend eating chicken and you think it's meat and he's eating it with a glass of milk. Well, you might say, well, why are you eating meat with milk? So just in case, they said you can't eat chicken as well with milk. So, okay, so you're understanding the context now of the Pharisees. They're discussing not just the written law, but they're discussing something called the oral law. Oh. My time's moving fast. They're discussing something called the oral law. The oral law is passed down generation to generation. Remember that the centralized religion is in the temple. The priests are the ones who control that religion. The everyday people, they can't read the Torah, they can't read the Bible. And so they passed these traditions, these laws down through the oral law, generation after generation after generation. So the Pharisees, they know the oral law. They know these laws that have been passed down. And they're basing all of their knowledge, all of their practice of Judaism, their development of Judaism, upon that oral law. Now, there was one other thing that the Pharisees set themselves up as: the keepers of the religion. Therefore, if a Messiah is going to come, they're going to be the first to know about it. They're going to be the first to approve this is the Messiah. And the messianic teachings were very prevalent during this period of turmoil. Next slide, please. In contradiction to that, we have the Sadducees, who are the aristocratic classes. They were very connected to Rome. They did not believe in the oral law at all. Everything was based upon the written law, the pure, simple explanation of the written law. Okay, they consolidated their power around the temple, around Jerusalem. That's where they had their supporters. They were very Hellenized. While being also leaders of the religion, they were also quite Hellenized. Next slide, please. So already, I'm going to go back now to the destruction of the first temple, take you on a very quick journey through time. When Solomon's temple was destroyed in 568 BCE, the Israelites were exiled to Babylon. Suddenly, they don't have a place to worship. They don't know how to worship. How do we worship? Well, we don't have a temple. We can't make sacrifices. What do? So, and within a generation, they didn't even speak the language of their fathers anymore. So we have the prophets Ezra and Nehemiah who stepped up and said, well, let's read a portion of the Torah, of the Bible, every week, and we'll make up some prayers so you know how to pray. Fast forward, they came back to their land of Judea, and they put that into practice. So yes, there was a central temple, but they began to spring up synagogues, places of meeting places, I would say, all over wherever the Jews settled. And they practiced these prayers that they had been taught, and they evolved. They practiced reading from the Torah scroll. They debated the teachings. And up here we've got a picture of Capernaum. Some of you will know Capernaum from the New Testament. Jesus went to Capernaum, and this is on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and this is what it looks like today. And this was a Beit Knesset, a synagogue. Knesset means a meeting place. In Israel, the Knesset is the parliament. It's a meeting place, a place of discussion. And that's what they did there. So we can see now, I've got just enough time to explain about two rabbis who lived just before the time of Jesus. In fact, one lived beyond the time of Jesus. Two of the greatest rabbis at this time, one was called Hillel the Elder. We don't exactly know when he lived, but he probably died before Jesus was born. But these two, and the other one was called Shammai, Hillel and Shammai, two opposing forces, one very strict, and the other a little bit more lenient in their interpretation of the laws in the Torah. Famously attributed to Hillel was the statement. There's a lot of things he discussed, but he said, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. This is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn." Do those words sound familiar? Mm-hmm. What is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. And we're talking 10, 20 years before the birth of Jesus now. So here we are, we've got Pharisees on one side, we've got divisions within the Pharisees discussing what the laws of the Torah mean and how legalistic we need to be. And on the other side, we've got the Sadducees, who are just interested in their power and consolidating their power. And by the way, what we practice today is Pharisaic Judaism. Very legalistic, very focused on the laws of the Torah and the interpretation of those laws. Okay, last slide, please. Yeah. So, in summary, the Maccabees fought against overwhelming odds, a small ragtag band of freedom fighters rising up against the might of the Seleucid Empire, one of the most powerful empires of its time. Their struggle wasn't merely a military campaign, it was an act of faith and devotion to everything they believed in. And against all odds, their determination and trust in the righteousness of their cause led them to victory. They dispelled the darkness of oppression, overthrowing the Seleucid Empire and restoring hope to the people of Judea. This triumph, it wasn't just political, it was spiritual. It was a renewal symbolized by the enduring light of the menorah, that light celebrated in the Hannukah candles. It stands as a beacon of resilience, hope, and the enduring presence of God's faithfulness. In a similar and even more profound way, 142 years later, after they lit that candelabrum in the temple, 142 years later, the birth of Jesus Christ brought an even greater light into the world. While the Maccabees' victory rekindled hope for a generation, Jesus' birth offered salvation for all humanity. His coming fulfilled ancient prophecies, extending God's love and redemption to all his people. John declared, "The light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it," from John 1:5. Where the Maccabees restored the temple, Jesus restored hearts, offering peace with God. His light continued to burn in believers' hearts, illuminating lives with grace and truth. Like the menorah's flames, his light cannot be extinguished, guiding us through every darkness and leading us to eternal life. So I hope in the last 20 minutes or so, I've managed to enlighten you to, first of all, the connection between these two very disparate festivals, and secondly, giving you a bit of context into what was the world like when Jesus fell into that world. Why was he arguing with the Pharisees? Why was he? What was the role of the Sadducees in all this? Why was he finding the Pharisees to be so legalistic in their interpretations of the Torah? And why was he questioning them even? Because everyone was questioning everything back then. And to come back to the reading of the scripture, so in John, Roger read, Jesus is rejected by the Jews. At the time of the festival of dedication that took place in Jerusalem, it was winter. That is Hannukah, the festival of the rededication of the temple. And that is the connection between our two scripture readings. Thank you.
Amen. If we had time, I'll invite questions. Do you have questions? Good plan. First century, he did a summary of this rich and long history of how Israel has come about, for us to understand what it was and how it is today. For Christians, I learned that there were 20 plus different branches of Judaisms. And he said Pharisees, Sadducees, that's the children, if you want to do children ministry, this is how you remind them. Sadducees. Sadducees didn't really survive as much as Pharisees have, and who we are is Jesus Judaism that came about in first century, and I thought that was very I think it enriches our understanding of how Jesus came about, to know all the background and the relationship, or the why we hear about Hanukkah and Christmas around winter time. Now, there's one thing that I see that shines through both festival, if we call it festival, is the light. The light that comes through during the time of the Jewish people celebrating Hanukkah, and Jesus, our light, came into this dark world. So as the last slide said, when each of us shine that light, despite that we have different faith or different religion, we still can be the light to this world. So I just want us to hold on to that and remember that we are Jesus' light.